LX1326, ready to start up. Arizona 1019, ready to start up. LX1416, ready to start up. LX2026, ready to start up. LX1348, hold position, Zurich ground. LX1954, ready to start up. Zurich ground, holding position, LX1348. PS472, ready to start up. LX1168, hold position, Zurich ground. Zurich ground, holding position, LX1168. LX1348, resume taxiing, Zurich ground. Zurich ground, continuing taxi, LX1348. LX1168, resume taxiing, Zurich ground. Zurich ground, continuing taxi, LX1168. LX1168, hold position, Zurich ground. Zurich ground, holding position, LX1168. Zurich startup, this is LX1326, position G6 information kilo, IFR to Moscow Domodedovo, request startup. Milano Malpensa startup, this is Arizona 1019, position 657, information Zulu, IFR to Roma Fiumicino Leonardo da Vinci, request startup. Zurich startup, this is LX1416, position G5 information kilo, IFR to Belgrade, request startup. Zurich startup, this is LX2026, position C55 information kilo, IFR to Barajas, request startup. Zurich startup, this is LX1954, position A7, information kilo, IFR to Barcelona El Prat, request startup. Fly 348, hold position, Zurich ground. Zurich ground, holding position, Fly 348. Zurich startup, this is PS472, position HAT2 information kilo, IFR to Borispol, request startup. LX1168, resume taxiing, Zurich clearance call 121.90, Zurich startup control. Arizona 1019, startup approved, Zulu correct, runway 35L, fly runway heading squawk 163, for taxi clearance call 121.90, Milano Malpensa startup control. Zurich ground, continuing taxi, LX1168. LX1326, startup approved, kilo correct, runway 34, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, Zurich startup control. LX1954, startup approved, kilo correct, runway 32, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, Zurich startup control. PS472, startup approved, kilo correct, runway 34, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, Zurich startup control. LX1416, startup approved, kilo correct, runway 34, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, Zurich startup control. Zurich startup approved, kilo correct, runway 32, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, LX1954. Milano Malpensa startup approved, Zulu correct, runway 35L, fly runway heading squawk 163, for taxi clearance call 121.90, Arizona 1019. Zurich startup approved, kilo correct, runway 34, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, LX1326. Zurich startup approved, kilo correct, runway 34, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, LX1416. Zurich startup approved, kilo correct, runway 34, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, PS 472. LX 1168, hold position, Zurich ground. Zurich ground, holding position, LX 1168. Zurich startup approved, Kilo correct, runway 32, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, LX 2026. Fly 348, resume taxiing, Zurich ground. Zurich ground, continuing taxi, fly 348. Zurich startup, switching to 121.90, LX 1326. Milano Malpensa startup, switching to 121.90, Arizona 1019. Fly 348, hold position, Zurich ground. Zurich startup, switching to 121.90, LX 1954. Zurich ground, holding position, fly 348. Zurich startup, switching to 121.90, LX 1416. Milano Malpensa startup, with you, Arizona 1019. Zurich startup, with you, LX 1954. Zurich startup, switching to 121.90, LX 2026. Zurich startup, with you, LX 2026. Arizona 1019, Roger, Milano Malpensa startup.
80 knots.
Zurich startup, with you, LX 1326. LX 1326, Roger, Zurich startup. Zurich startup, with you, LX 1416. Flight 348, resume taxiing, Zurich ground. Zurich ground, continuing taxi, flight 348. LX 1416, Roger, Zurich startup. LX 2026, Roger, Zurich startup. LX 1954, Roger, Zurich startup. Zurich startup, switching to 121.90, PS 472. Milano Malpensa startup, request taxi clearance, Arizona 1019. Zurich startup, request pushback, LX 1954. Zurich startup, request pushback, LX 2026. LH 2369, hold position, Zurich ground. Zurich startup, with you, PS 472. Zurich ground, holding position, LH 2369. PS 472, Roger, Zurich startup. Flight 348, hold position, Zurich ground. Zurich startup, request pushback, PS 472. Arizona 1019, cleared to taxi, Milano Malpensa startup. Zurich ground, holding position, Flight 348. LX 2026, pushback approved, Zurich startup. LX 1954, pushback approved, Zurich startup. LH 2369, resume taxiing, Zurich ground. Zurich startup, request pushback, LX 1416. Zurich ground, continuing taxi, LH 2369. Zurich startup, request pushback, LX 1326. LH 2369, hold position, Zurich ground. Cafe 234, hold position, Milano Malpensa ground. Zurich ground, holding position, LH 2369. LX 1326, pushback approved, Zurich startup. Milano Malpensa ground, holding position, Cafe 234. PS 472, stand by, Zurich startup. LX 1416, pushback approved, Zurich startup. Zurich ground, ready to taxi, LX 1954. LX 1954, clear to taxi, Zurich ground. Zurich ground, ready to taxi, LX 1326. LX 1326, clear to taxi, Zurich ground. Zurich ground, clear to taxi, LX 1326. Zurich ground, clear to taxi, LX 1954. Zurich ground, ready to taxi, LX 1416. taxiing, Milano Malpensa ground. LX1416, clear to taxi, Zurich ground. Milano Malpensa ground, continuing taxi, Cathay 234. Zurich ground, clear to taxi, LX1416. LH2369, resume taxiing, Zurich ground. Zurich ground, ready to taxi, LX2026. LX2026, clear to taxi, Zurich ground. Zurich ground, clear to taxi, LX2026. Zurich ground, continuing taxi, LH2369. LH2369, hold position, Zurich ground. Zurich ground, holding position, LH2369. LX1628, ready to start up. LX2422, ready to start up. LH2369, resume taxiing, Zurich ground. LX1270, ready to start up. Zurich ground, continuing taxi, LH2369. LX1250, ready to start up. LH2369, hold position, Zurich ground. Zurich ground, holding position, LH2369. Zurich startup, this is LX1628, position H88 information kilo, IFR to Milano Malpensa, request startup. Zurich startup, this is LX1250, position G14 information kilo, IFR to Stockholm Arlanda, request startup. Zurich startup, this is LX1270, position B45 information kilo, IFR to Castro, request startup. Zurich startup, this is LX2422, position E46 information kilo, IFR to Dubai Intel, request startup. LX1628, startup approved, kilo correct, runway 32, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, Zurich startup control. LX1270, startup approved, kilo correct, runway 34, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, Zurich startup control. LX2422, startup approved, kilo correct, runway 34, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, Zurich startup control. Zurich startup approved, kilo correct, runway 32, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, LX1628. LX1250, startup approved, kilo correct, runway 34, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, Zurich startup control. Zurich startup approved, kilo correct, runway 34, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, LX2422. Zurich startup approved, kilo correct, runway 34, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, LX1250. Zurich startup approved, kilo correct, runway 34, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, LX1270. Zurich startup, switching to 121.90, LX1628. Zurich startup, switching to 121.90, LX1250. Zurich startup, switching to 121.90, LX1270. Zurich startup, with you, LX1628. Zurich startup, with you, LX1270. LX1628, Roger, Zurich startup. LX1270, Roger, Zurich startup. Zurich startup, switching to 121.90, LX242. Zurich startup, with you, LX242. LX242, Roger, Zurich startup. Zurich startup, with you, LX1250. Zurich startup, request pushback, LX1270. Zurich startup, request pushback, LX1628. Zurich startup, request pushback, LX24T2. LX1628, standby, Zurich startup. LX1628, pushback approved, Zurich startup. LX1270, pushback approved, Zurich startup. LX24T2, standby, Zurich startup. Zurich ground, ready to taxi, LX1628. LX1628, clear to taxi, Zurich ground. Zurich ground, clear to taxi, LX1628. Zurich ground, ready to taxi, LX1270. LX1270, clear to taxi, Zurich ground. Zurich ground, clear to taxi, LX1270. LX1250, Roger, Zurich startup. Zurich startup, request pushback, LX1250. LX1250, pushback approved, Zurich startup. Zurich ground, ready to taxi, LX1250. LX1250, clear to taxi, Zurich ground. Zurich ground,
25
clear to taxi, LX1250. LX728, ready to start up. LX638, ready to start up. LX2254,
25.
ready to start up. LX1250, hold position, Zurich ground. Zurich ground, holding position, LX1250. LX1736, ready to start up. Zurich start up, this is LX638, position C57, information kilo, IFR to Paris Charles de Gaulle, request start up. Zurich start up, this is LX2254, position G3 information kilo, IFR to Ferric G Budapest, request start up. Zurich start up, this is LX728, position G4 information kilo, IFR to Chapal, request start up. LX728, startup approved, kilo correct, runway 34, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, Zurich startup control. LX638, startup approved, kilo correct, runway 32, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, Zurich startup control. LX2254, startup approved, kilo correct, runway 34, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, Zurich startup control. Zurich startup approved, kilo correct, runway 34, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, LX728. Zurich startup approved, kilo correct, runway 34, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, LX2254. Zurich startup, this is LX1736, position G2 information kilo, IFR to Roma Fiumicino Leonardo da Vinci, request startup. LX1736, startup approved, kilo correct, runway 32, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, Zurich startup control. Zurich startup approved, kilo correct, runway 32, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, LX1736. Zurich startup approved, kilo correct, runway 32, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, LX638. Zurich startup, switching to 121.90, LX728. LX1720, hold position, Zurich ground. Zurich startup, switching to 121.90, LX2254. Zurich ground, holding position, LX1720. Zurich startup, switching to 121.90, LX638. Zurich startup, with you, LX728. Zurich startup, with you, LX638. LX728, Roger, Zurich startup. LX638, Roger, Zurich startup. Zurich startup, with you, LX2254. LX2254, Roger, Zurich startup. Zurich startup, switching to 121.90, LX1736. Zurich startup, request pushback, LX728. LX1072, hold position, Zurich ground. Zurich ground, holding position, LX1072. Zurich startup, request pushback, LX2254. Zurich startup, with you, LX1736. Cafe 382, ready to start up. LX728, pushback approved, Zurich startup. LX2254, pushback approved, Zurich startup. LX1736, Roger, Zurich startup. Zurich ground, ready to taxi, LX728. Zurich startup, request pushback, LX1736. LX728, clear to taxi, Zurich ground. Zurich startup, this is Cafe 382, position A46, information Kilo, IFR to Hong Kong Intel, request startup. Zurich ground, clear to taxi, LX728. Zurich startup, request pushback, LX638. LX728, hold position, Zurich ground. Zurich ground, holding position, LX728. LX1736, pushback approved, Zurich startup. Zurich ground, ready to taxi, LX2254. LX2254, clear to taxi, Zurich ground. Zurich ground, clear to taxi, LX2254. LX638, pushback approved, Zurich startup. LX1250, resume taxiing, Zurich ground. Zurich ground, continuing taxi, LX1250. LX728, resume taxiing, Zurich ground. Zurich ground, continuing taxi, LX728. Zurich ground, ready to taxi, LX1736.
Terrain.
LX1736, clear to taxi, Zurich ground. Zurich ground, clear to taxi, LX1736. Zurich ground, ready to taxi, LX638. LX638, clear to taxi, Zurich ground. Zurich ground, clear to taxi, LX638. LX1056, ready to start up. Zurich startup, this is LX1056, position A49, information Kilo, IFR to Hamburg, request startup. LX1056, startup approved, Kilo correct, runway 34, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, Zurich startup control. Zurich startup approved, Kilo correct, runway 34, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, LX1056. Zurich startup, switching to 121.90, LX1056. Zurich startup, with you, LX1056. LX1056, Roger, Zurich startup. Zurich startup, request pushback, LX1056. LX1056, standby, Zurich startup. Nuremberg approach, LH2158, information Delta. LH2158, expect Hills approach 10, Nuremberg approach. LH2158, runway 10 clear to land, Nuremberg approach. PS312, ready to start up. LX1018, ready to start up. Nuremberg approach runway 10 clear to land, LH2158. LH2158, contact tower at 118.70, Nuremberg approach. Nuremberg approach Roger, switching to tower at 118.70, LH2158. Milano Malpensa startup, this is PS312, position 304, information Zulu, IFR to Borisbol, request startup. Zurich startup, this is LX1018, position G1 information Kilo, IFR to Dusseldorf, request startup. PS312, startup approved, Zulu correct, runway 35L, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, Milano Malpensa startup control. LX1018, startup approved, Kilo correct, runway 34, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, Zurich startup control. Milano Malpensa startup, LX1018, Roger, Zurich startup. PS312, Roger, Milano Malpensa startup. Milano Malpensa startup, request pushback, PS312. Zurich startup, request pushback, LX1018. PS312, pushback approved, Milano Malpensa startup. LX1018, pushback approved, Zurich startup. WK2426, ready to start up. Milano Malpensa ground, ready to taxi, PS312. Zurich ground, ready to taxi, LX1018. LX1018, clear to taxi, Zurich ground. PS312, clear to taxi, Milano Malpensa ground. Zurich ground, clear to taxi, LX1018. Zurich startup, this is WK2426, position A9, information Kilo, IFR to Samedan Lorca, request startup. Milano Malpensa ground, clear to taxi, PS312. LX966, ready to start up. LX1486, ready to start up. Cafe 382, startup approved, Kilo correct, runway 34, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, Zurich startup control. LX977, hold position, Zurich ground. Zurich ground, holding position, LX977. Zurich startup, this is LX966, position G13 information Kilo, IFR to Berlin Tegel, request startup. Zurich startup, this is LX1486, position 255 information Kilo, IFR to Praharazine, request startup. LX966, startup approved, Kilo correct, runway 34, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, Zurich startup control. LX1486, startup approved, Kilo correct, runway 34, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, Zurich startup control. Zurich startup approved, Kilo correct, runway 1.90, LX966. Zurich startup, with you, LX966. LX966, Roger, Zurich startup. LX977, resume taxiing, Zurich ground. Zurich startup, switching to 121.90, LX1486. Zurich ground, continuing taxi, LX977. Zurich startup, with you, LX1486. LX1486, Roger, Zurich startup. LX2254, hold position, Zurich ground. Zurich ground, holding position, LX2254. Zurich startup, request pushback, LX966. Zurich startup, request pushback, LX1486. LX966, pushback approved, Zurich startup. LX1486, pushback approved, Zurich startup. Zurich ground, ready to taxi, LX966. LX966, cleared to taxi, Zurich ground. Zurich ground, cleared to taxi, LX966. Zurich ground, ready to taxi, LX1486. LX1486, cleared to taxi, Zurich ground. Zurich ground, cleared to taxi, LX1486. A968, ready to start up. LX568, ready to start up. LX1674, ready to start up. Zurich startup approved, carrier curl, runway 34, fly runway heading.